My name is Katie Howarth Ryan, and I'd like to tell you about a small town in rural Wisconsin called Cooksville. And I've lived in Wisconsin for almost 35 years. I moved from Manhattan. So it was really a discovery of what agricultural land was like and what living right sort of next to nature was like for
Yeah.
me.
So when did you first move there? Like, yeah, when did you first move there? What was it like?
Well, when I moved there in 1986, um, yeah, I sort of naively thought I was, moving to some sort of country that I was more familiar with, but it turns out it's very different. And it's a historic town because it was platted by New Englanders who had a common green and then some houses. But of course, it didn't grow very much, so there are some houses, but mostly it's still surrounded by farmland. And when I moved there in 1986, there was tobacco being grown all over this area in Wisconsin. And you'd see the long tobacco barns with slatted sides that allowed for the tobacco to dry. And you'd look over the fields and you could see the large broadleaf tobacco plants. There was a general store in Cooksville that sold supplies to the tobacco farmers. But then, and there'd be huge tobacco barns, this yellow cream brick building with different kinds of tobacco brands painted on the side in towns like Edgerton or Evansville or Stoughton. So, Cooksville just happens to be a village of about 90 people in this rural setting. So, when I first moved there, it was largely agricultural in between Madison, Wisconsin, the capital, and small towns and cities surrounding it. Like there'd be to the south Beloit, where Beloit College is, some people would know, or Janesville, which has like 60,000 people. But mostly it was a community of farmers. And it living in the country and being able to see this large expanse of horizon is very different than the East Coast. And it's really a place where the land and the weather makes a big difference. So, for instance, when I was growing up, you could look across the water and you would see the clouds in a large expanse. But in Wisconsin, you look across the land and it's flat enough that you see the clouds stretching to the horizon line. And the land itself is mostly cultivated, mostly farming or dairy farming. So when I first moved there, it had the tobacco farms. But then over time, and it had been farmed historically.
Mm-hmm.
That Wisconsin was this town was founded around 1838, and it was largely people who were moving there to be farmers and then pursue whatever other, sort of industry they could have. But as time went on, and tobacco companies left Wisconsin and were no longer growing tobacco there, other crops stepped in. Like people would grow soybeans, for instance. That's a huge crop now still in Wisconsin, or the family farms began to change and get larger and larger. So instead of a 40-acre farm supporting a family, it would be 160 acres supporting 700 cows and a family. And so, for instance, the use of the general store in town, which was the longest running, continuous running general store in Wisconsin, used to have its livelihood from farmers, but now they would get, simple
Mm.
supplies and implements, but now it became more sort of like a stop for
Yeah.
bicyclists or, um, you know, they couldn't really carry as much because they couldn't, they weren't making as much money. But anyway, eventually it's still operating and it's just found different ways to exist over time.
Mm-hmm.
But the farming life still exists in this area, but it's slowly changed. The crops have changed. And then this is the heart of where there are government subsidies for not growing
Oh yeah.
crops. So there's a lot of land use issues here. And I was on a zoning board for 12 years. So in the townships, there could be, for instance, this idea that you want to preserve ag land so that you can be in the federal credit program, or you want to, they want to, well, that's the main, that's a
Yeah.
huge incentive. The other thing that happens is sometimes farm families want to split off a house with some acres, maybe for, a child or some other family member so they can have their own house, or they build a new house. But then what often happens is then eventually that house gets sold to somebody who's not a part of the family farm. And there was more sort of residential creep from towns like Madison or Stoughton or Oregon or Evansville. People wanting to have a little bit more land and build their own new home. So ag land, which was inexpensive comparative to residential lots, like 3,000 an acre, people could buy the minimum required, and in some places, like if it was rural residential, it would be 3 acres. It's the smallest lot you could have. Or if it's ag land, let's pretend it's like 15 acres, I think. So the basically there were more and more houses, and initially farmers would sell it on like a wood lot or something that was not productive. But then over time, as residential homes and the prices people were willing to pay rose, more development came in. But still, the township zoning was trying to keep it within the ag sort of land because
For the subsidies?
yeah, for the credits and the programs that they could qualify for federally. The thing about living out in the country instead of in the city, for instance, for me initially, were things like once I was outside in the yard, working in the yard, and I heard this whooshing sound. And I asked my neighbor, who was in this case quite close by, like, what highway was that I was hearing in the background? Like which I was trying to figure out which road this was. And he said, Katie, that's the wind in the pines. So literally, I really, couldn't translate the wind in the pines. They're beautiful, mature white pines, to being something natural. So that was kind of funny. And then another time, I was at my house, and my neighbor again called me and said, Katie, go to the end of your driveway. The northern lights are out. And so sure enough, in Cooksville, where there are no street lights, people don't have bright lights on their houses, it was totally dark. You could see beautiful stars and beautiful northern lights. Farms tend to have very bright lights in their driveways or near the barns or whatever. But this particular little village didn't have it has some farms on the outskirts, but not in these two small blocks.
Right, it's like the 2 blocks of residential surrounded by farmland, kind of?
Yes, exactly. And then the farmland, there's a lot of corn, a lot of things to support dairy farming, but crops to support cows. But then this area became mostly soybean. So it's like, I don't know, soybean capital of Wisconsin,
Yeah.
you know. And there were still big canning factories around, like Libby's and known brands, but the land is also used for recreation. And so tourism and hunting, are both two big uses for land. So,
Yeah.
In the area, that was another thing that was unusual, is that, come November, if you're driving around the countryside, there'll be these cars parked by the side of the road, and you look to the left or the right, and sure enough, you'll see people in blaze orange down in a field
Just like
hunting.
hunting. Do people
Yeah.
still do that with like more residential, like more houses around? Is it still?
Well, yes, actually they do. And so, like, sort of when there's a farm on the outskirts of like a little cluster of homes, that's often a conflict
Right.
because people will complain about, but obviously any responsible hunter should know
Like,
what
don't
they're
go
doing,
hunting. Right.
not to point in that direction, but you will hear the shots, and and you really should not take your dog on a walk over the fields, for instance,
Right.
because the deer are out and the hunters are out. But in Wisconsin, though agriculture historically was the largest endeavor. Tourism had been very big, and part of that is the hunting. So a lot of people will have some acres up north, as they say, and maybe a cabin or something that they go to for hunting week. Or I remember when I was trying to get a house project done, and I was talking to the contractor, and they're like, "Well, we're not going to be able to work, from this date to that date." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, why not?" Well, it's hunting season, so
Yeah, fair
your plumber's
enough.
gone, everybody goes hunting. So that's a different way that people relate to the land and the wildlife.
That sort of persisted throughout the whole time you
Oh yeah,
since
there is a lot of manufacturing in Wisconsin, but not in the area that I'm talking
yeah.
about. And this is really, there are parts slightly north that have more rock outcroppings, but this is really prime ag land.
Yeah. Oh, so just sort of like loop back to something you mentioned earlier. You said the village was like built around a green. It
Mm-hmm.
was sort of like a preserved green space. I know there's like a little forest there. So I guess how do you think like like that? As I know like growing up that act, there's sort of like a center for like activities and like community life. How do you think like that like set like land that's sort of set apart like
Right. So historically, what happened in this area of Wisconsin was there were things called the oak savannas. And so before it was farmed land, it was these grasses, savannas, and they had like bur oak mostly, or different oak trees. So you'd have an open grassy area and then clusters of oak trees. And sometimes they'd be clustered along ridges near a lake, like the Badfish Creek near Cooksville. But in this case, the Porter family from Massachusetts, who actually bought part of the land from Daniel Webster, um,
who,
moved
who was one of the
the
early
Daniel Webster.
yeah yeah
Yeah, he was really just a speculator,
mm-hmm.
but a land speculator. Anyway, the Porters came and they platted the village the way a New England village would be. So there was a common space that was set aside for an organization of the town around the common space. And for many years, the schoolhouse was on that green. Now it's a community center. And there's a nice oak wood, and then some maples and sugar maples. And, of course, because of like wilt now, there's a lot of concern to preserve the oaks, to replant some oaks, and to kind of care for these these areas.
Mm-hmm.
And then but outside there are these very large farms. So mostly now it's probably, I was thinking it is soybean, or a lot
Yeah,
of it is not even, again, not cultivated
yeah.
on purpose.
I remember one thing you mentioned a while at some point a while ago was how like the way that you like how you would take walks in Cooksville was sort of like dictated by like farmers' plots or like
Yeah,
the
what it
cornfield.
is like, for instance, Cooksville, you can walk, it's 1 mile around Cooksville. But outside of Cooksville, that has smaller platted roads, it's very large grid work that's based on farms. So, and most of the farms are 40 acres to start. So you might have several farms if you're, well to do. But so that means that if we were going to go for a walk outside Cooksville and we were going to stay on the paved area, you'd walk like 5 miles to get around the square. You could ask permission of the farmers to walk across their land, and a lot of people would allow you to do that. But basically, it's, you can't, a city block is different, but it's sort of like the rural equivalent of a
Oh, like
city
a very
block.
large city
Yeah,
block.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah, it's really kind of neat. And, but over time, there's still, like, for instance, there's still coyotes, there's still turkeys, there's
Mm-hmm.
still um, these little, like, groundhogs. There's still deer,
Oh,
obviously.
the prairie dogs
Oh,
would
the
come in
prairie dogs, that's what I was trying to
from the
say.
green.
So I don't feel like the nature, excuse me, the wildlife, despite the more population, it wasn't populous enough to prevent the wildlife from being there.
Yeah, like it's sort of maybe it's like as you say it's like sort of a similar like or like it's a slightly different density, but like the land seems being like cultivated less now, or like is it a move
I
away
think it
from
is a little bit
agriculture?
cultivate. Yes, I think it is cultivated less. Also, farms are so productive now
Mm-hmm.
that there's, as you know, this overproduction,
Right.
and so they don't need to be cultivating as much
Yeah.
anyway. So there'll be things like a corn maze for fun, you know,
Right.
or
Mm-hmm.
different uses of the land.
Yeah. Do you think so? I feel like one of the things that like is pretty important for Cooksville is that it is like so close to Madison, which is like a really like the capital and like really big commuter town. I think. Do you feel like it's sort of shifted to being more of like almost a Madison suburb, or like not to that point, or like
Well,
like the residents and stuff?
yeah, I think the thing
Mm.
about Cooksville, because it's a village of about 90 people, and it is a designated historic district, federal National Register of Historic Places. So people who live there are interested in probably
Mm-hmm.
historic preservation, but they want to be in the country, but they
Yeah.
like to have some neighbors. So, but they don't mind that they don't have city
Right.
services. Everybody's got their own septic and well, and so I think that it's been a commuting town from elsewhere for a pretty long
Mm-hmm.
time if you lived in the village. But maybe, but earlier there were a lot of either farmers or people that worked near the farms or, relatives that lived in
Mm-hmm.
Cooksville. And so that did fall away to, yes, being more people that commuted elsewhere for their jobs. There were lots of people who worked in, for I don't know why, but there were a lot of teachers in Cooksville, some that
Mm-hmm.
worked in Stoughton, some worked as far away as Beloit, some in Madison.
Mm-hmm.
So that did make a difference.
Yeah. Do you feel like I guess like when you were moving out, I guess like from like comparing like Cooksville when you first moved there, to now, or like even like in Madison, the city where you currently are, do you feel like the way people like think of or like treat like the plots of land that their like homes are on is different, or like the way they approach like versus like having like a very carefully manicured yard? Do you think it's more like trying to preserve some of like the natural stuff that's there, or what do you think?
Well, it's funny
Or is it
because
more agriculture? I don't
no,
know.
it's just funny because when I was in Cooksville, having grown up outside of New York and New Jersey, and here's my first home that I own after living in apartments, I'm out there raking the leaves in the fall. And my neighbor, who's lived in Cooksville for 20 years by then, is like, "Katie, what are you doing? We don't have to do that, and I'm like, "You don't?" And like, "No, no, you just do that once in the spring."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh, okay,
Yeah.
that's good enough." So there's a lot less concern about There's no concern practically about manicured yards. I mean, people are interested in gardening. I was very interested in the trees on our
Mm-hmm.
property because we had a lot of unusual trees like a sycamore tree, larch, European larch, tamarack, horse chestnut, things that the owners in like the 20s had planted.
Yeah. So wasn't there
So
like a garden, like a
yeah,
very
there had
fancy?
been a very elaborate garden that a gentleman named Ralph Warner had planted behind our house, which had little, almost like little, you know, patterned little walks and whatnot. But it that so that and he had a little pond that was turned into a sandbox when we were there.
Mm-hmm.
But so compared to Madison, where there's much more of a concern, I mean, there's even ordinances that you cut your grass.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that people don't cut, but people cut their grass in Cooksville, but there's also some prairie restoration going on in Cooksville,
Mm-hmm.
so there is some land managed with burns and whatnot. But
Oh, do you think? Yeah.
so, you
Do you
know,
think that's started? Is that more recent, or has that always sort of been
no,
going
that's
on?
probably within the last probably the last 15 years. There are a few of them. One is the farm that's closest to the intersection with 59 and 138, where there's a little stream, and they
Mm-hmm.
have like maybe 20 acres that goes from cultivated land to a creek, which is very
Mm-hmm.
marshy. And then there's another area that's further up out the hill that the people just wanted to do. So they just put their land in prairie,
Nice.
and it takes a while to establish it, but now they have restored it.
Mm.
And that's just a look back to that oak savanna. You
Yeah.
know, somebody, it's a person who wants to do it. They want to make it. I mean, it's not low maintenance in a way for a while,
Yeah.
but they want to make it
Back to
recall that natural.
right, like where it was
Yeah,
before,
yeah,
prior to. Huh.
yeah. And
Interesting.
there still are things out there like 4-H and whatnot, but you know, far fewer people are going into farming now.
Mm-hmm.
So the land use has changed, the economy's changed somewhat. The people, yes, the people who live there
Mm-hmm.
are different.
Yeah. I guess that's sort of like a one more like general question, and we could do maybe some wrap up. So, I was wondering just as you moved out of Cooksville eventually, I was wondering like if you feel like you relate to it or uh, like the land or just like visiting differently, like living there versus now not living there, like the
Oh
activities
yes,
and stuff.
sure. Like for instance, when I lived there, I mean, every day you could wake up and look across the green, see the outline of the oak trees branching over the leaning over the green, and beyond oak trees at the edge of the farm field, and there was sunrise. So, you know, and it was free, and it was free of buildings, this view. So, you know, you really feel like you're out in it. Or if you wanted to, like when kids were little, you know, you want to go build a snowman, you run out on the green and you build a snowman. Or if you want to, and you've got all this expanse around you. Or if you want to go see the sunset, you walk up a hill and you're looking over rolling farmland. So it's quite a different experience because you're out there in nature all the time. You're not, there are no stores besides the
Mm-hmm.
general store, and no sidewalks. I mean, you're just a part of the land. Whereas in Madison, where I live now, I happen to live near a park, and so, but it's a very different experience because, for instance, in Cooksville, if I saw an owl, it would be flying low across the green, like, you know, hunting. And in Madison, when I hear an owl, it's up in a tree near my house, stationary, because there are buildings and trees, and you're not gonna get that kind of view. So it's a different. It's still, nature is still clearly there, and I'm kind of surprised. Like, I've seen bald
Yeah.
eagles at a pond near this park, but um, yeah. So it is still kind of, oh, I've seen a red fox go down the street
Oh
in
yeah,
Madison.
just it was running down the street in the
Yeah,
middle of the
that's
street.
just
Yeah.
crazy. So, but again, there's way too much light to see northern lights or even the stars for that matter. So, the stars in Cooksville were beautiful, and there was a
Mm.
big expanse of them because there was this large open space. So, I think now to get that kind of experience when I go visit Cooksville or go elsewhere, you know, I'm intentionally going there for that, whereas I just lived among it,
Yeah.
which was a different feeling. And I got
Mm-hmm.
used to the wind in the pines.
Eventually.
Yes.
Yeah, and it sounds like people worked a lot to make sure that Cooksville stayed like preserved, I guess, or like the natural land was, or at least
Yes, I
or it worked
think
out that way
people,
maybe.
yes, I think people do care about it a lot. There are lots of different groups. Like there's a group that's trying to restore the oak trees on the green
Mm-hmm.
and preserve what's there, and there are groups that are interested in the buildings. And then there is a community center that brings people together for different programs, some of which, like there was one recently with two gentlemen, Larry Reed and Jerry Apps, who talked about the history of one room schoolhouses, including Cooksville's one room schoolhouse and the role that it played among the farm families,
Mm-hmm.
especially initially. So um, there are people there that are concerned about the land, and you know, and Wisconsin has a huge history with Aldo Leopold
Mm.
and John Muir and people that are interested in not just the utility of the land, but the
Right.
beauty of the land. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right. Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts on your like?
Well, I
Like
think wherever, I think that living in Wisconsin and among these kind of rolling farmlands, as a person was used to mountains growing up and used to more just forests or different kinds of environment, I really came to appreciate the rolling farmlands and the the huge horizon that you
Mm-hmm.
can see. And the fact that weather really matters, you know,
Yeah.
whether it's, you know, in New York, if you're talking about the weather, like, you know, you really are, it's an empty conversation.
Yeah.
If you're talking about the weather in Wisconsin, it can mean anything from, you know, like flooding, tornadoes, or a beautiful sunny summer day. So
Mm-hmm.
that's been really different. But I think that wherever I am, nature's an important thing. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
glad that I've had this experience.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome.